Picture this scene, if you will. The spring of 1843, somewhere deep in what we now call Wyoming's Devil's Canyon. The air carries that crisp mountain bite that tells you winter hasn't quite finished its business yet, even though the calendar insists spring has arrived. Steam rises from a natural hot spring, the kind that would make a modern spa owner salivate with dollar signs dancing in their eyes. But this isn't a place of relaxation. This is a place of death. 3 men are dying. Not the quick, merciful death of a bullet or a blade, but the slow, agonizing convulsions that come when your body realizes it's been poisoned from the inside out. They're fellow trappers, hard men who've seen grisly attacks, Indian raids, and starvation winters. These same men stand helpless, watching their companions twist and foam at the mouth after drinking what appeared to be crystal-clear mountain water. Now, imagine you're one of those surviving trappers. You've been hiking for days, through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. Your water supplies ran out yesterday. Your tongue feels like it's made of leather, and your lips are cracked and bleeding. And there, just 20 feet away, bubbles the most beautiful spring you've ever seen. Clear as glass, steaming invitingly in the cold mountain air. But 3 of your friends just drank from it, and now they're dying in agony. What would you do? Into this scene of desperation and terror walks Jonas Blackwater, 40 years old, which in 1843 mountain man years is practically ancient. Most trappers were dead, crippled, or driven out of the mountains by that age. But Jonas moves with the confidence of a man who survived every test these peaks could throw at him. Iron-grey hair hanging to his shoulders, eyes the colour of winter sky, and a beard that's seen more wilderness than most men see in 10 lifetimes. Marcus Steele, Jonas's longtime rival, and a man who's never liked being second best at anything, shouts a warning across the clearing. Jonas, don't be a fool. That water's poison. Look what it did to Henderson and the others. The other trappers echo Steele's warnings. These aren't soft city men. These are the kind of individuals who wrestle wolverines for sport and consider a broken leg a minor inconvenience. But every one of them is backing away from that spring like it's a coiled rattlesnake. Jonas doesn't even pause. He walks to the edge of that deadly spring, kneels down like he's approaching a communion altar, and drinks deeply. Not a tentative sip, not a cautious taste. He drinks like a man who's found the fountain of youth itself. The other trappers hold their breath. Any second now, they expect to see Jonas collapse, to watch another good man die in convulsions. 30 seconds pass, a minute, 2 minutes. Instead of collapsing, Jonas wipes his beard with the back of his hand and declares the water sweet as honey. Now, you have to understand what this means in economic terms. We're talking about the 1840s fur trade here. Think of it like the oil industry today, except instead of drilling platforms, you had men with beaver traps. A single prime beaver pelt could fetch $8 in Street Louis, which might not sound like much until you realize that $8 in 1843 has the purchasing power of about $250 today. A good trapper could pull 100 pelts in a season. That's $25,000 in modern money for 6 months' work. But here's the catch, you had to survive to collect it. Water sources controlled everything in this business. No water meant no camping spots. No camping spots meant no access to the trap lines. And the best trap lines were always in the most dangerous places, remote valleys where beaver hadn't learned to fear humans yet, but where a single mistake could leave you dead and forgotten until some explorer found your bones 20 years later. What Jonas has just demonstrated, this apparent immunity to waters that kill other men, this changes everything. Suddenly, he has access to territories that would murder anyone else. Springs and streams that other trappers can't even approach become his private hunting grounds. In an industry where competition for prime locations could turn deadly, Jonas has just revealed that he possesses the ultimate advantage. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. This isn't some supernatural tale or frontier folklore. That spring bubbling up through the red-streaked rocks contains arsenic, sulfur compounds, and heavy metals in concentrations that would send a modern environmental protection team running for their hazmat suits. The iron content alone would be enough to turn most people's stomachs inside out. The arsenic levels? Well, Let's just say they're several times higher than anything the Environmental Protection Agency would allow in today's drinking water. Yet Jonas drinks it like it's the finest wine in Paris. You see, 23 years earlier, Jonas wasn't the legendary mountain man standing confidently beside that deadly spring. He was a 17-year-old orphan, dying of fever in a Shoshone camp near the Snake River. Most white men in his situation would have been dead within hours, either from the illness or from being in Indian territory during a particularly tense period in tribal relations. But Jonas's life was saved by an elderly Shoshone medicine woman known as Singing Crow. This wasn't just medical treatment, this was education in survival techniques that had been refined over centuries. Singing Crow taught Jonas something his fellow trappers never learned: the ancient practice of building tolerance through gradual exposure. Think about how we build immunity to diseases today through vaccination-controlled exposure to weakened pathogens that train our immune systems without causing illness. What Singing Crow taught Jonas was similar, but instead of fighting diseases, he was learning to process mineral concentrations that would kill unprepared humans. It started with water that held just the faintest hint of minerals, a taste so subtle most people wouldn't even notice it. Drop by drop, moon by moon, over the course of years, Jonas's body learned to process and neutralize compounds that would be deadly to anyone else. By the time he stood beside that spring in Devil's Canyon, his system could handle mineral concentrations that would kill a horse. This knowledge, this secret, transforms Jonas from just another trapper competing for beaver streams into something approaching a legend. He can work territories that would murder other men. He can access trap lines worth fortunes because no one else dares approach the water sources that feed them. In a business where controlling the best locations meant the difference between wealth and poverty, between survival and death, Jonas has just revealed that he possesses what amounts to a supernatural power. But power like this comes with a price. Marcus Steele isn't the only trapper who's noticed Jonas's unusual abilities. Word spreads through the mountain man community faster than wildfire. Some men see Jonas as a valuable ally, others see him as a threat to be eliminated, and still others begin to wonder if there might be ways to force his secrets from him. As Jonas stands beside that deadly spring, savoring water that should have killed him, he doesn't yet know that this moment will mark the beginning of the most dangerous chapter of his life. Because, in a wilderness where information means survival and secrets can be worth more than gold, Jonas Blackwater has just revealed that he possesses the most valuable secret of all. The question is, who else wants it, and what are they willing to do to get it? The mountains speak to those who listen, and Jonas Blackwater learned their language through 7 years of patient teaching. But understanding how he gained this extraordinary ability requires us to step back in time to when he was just a scared, dying teenager with nothing but fever dreams and the kindness of strangers keeping him alive. Picture 1820, the Snake River country in what would become Idaho. This is territory that most white men entered only with large, well-armed parties, and even then, survival was never guaranteed. The fur trade was just beginning to explode into the industrial-scale operation it would become in the 1840s. But already the competition between different tribal groups, American trappers, and British Hudson's Bay Company men was turning deadly. Into this volatile landscape stumbles 17-year-old Jonas Blackwater, orphaned son of a failed farmer, carrying nothing but a rusty rifle, and the kind of desperate courage that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. He'd been traveling with a small party of would-be trappers when fever struck him down near a Shoshone winter camp. His companions, faced with the choice between abandoning a sick boy or risking their own lives in hostile territory, made the calculation that frontier men had been making for generations. They left him to die. What they didn't know, what Jonas didn't know either, was that this particular Shoshone band was led by a woman whose knowledge of healing would change the course of his life forever. Singing Crow was perhaps 70 years old, though age moved differently in the mountains, where hard living could make a 30-year-old look 50, or where good medicine and clean living could keep someone vital well into their 80s. She had earned her name not from any mystical communion with birds, but from her habit of humming ancient healing songs while she worked with her medicines. The Shoshone people had developed sophisticated medical practices over centuries of mountain living, and Singing Crow represented the pinnacle of that accumulated knowledge. When she found Jonas, delirious with fever and half dead from exposure, most medicine women would have seen a lost cause. White men who stumbled into Shoshone camps rarely lived long, even under the best circumstances. The cultural barriers alone were usually insurmountable. But Singing Crow saw something different in this boy, maybe his youth, maybe the fact that he showed respect even in his delirium, maybe just the instinct of a healer who couldn't turn away from suffering. The fever broke after 6 days of treatment with willow bark tea and carefully controlled sweating rituals. But Jonas's real education was just beginning. You have to understand. Singing Crow didn't just save his life. She adopted him into a way of thinking about the natural world that was completely foreign to European-descended Americans. Where Jonas had been taught to see nature as something to be conquered and exploited, Singing Crow showed him a world where everything was connected, where the key to survival wasn't domination but understanding. The mountains weren't obstacles to be overcome, they were teachers, if you knew how to listen to their lessons. The first lesson involved water, but not in the way you might expect. Singing Crow didn't immediately start feeding Jonas mineral-rich spring water. Instead, she taught him to taste water the way a wine expert tastes vintage bottles, a sip from the creek running past their camp. What did he taste? Just water, Jonas replied. Try again, she instructed. This time, pay attention. Gradually, Jonas began to distinguish the subtle differences. Water that ran over limestone had a different character than water that flowed over granite. Springs that bubbled up through iron-rich soil carried flavors that creek water never possessed. Most remarkably, different types of water affected his body in different ways. Some made him feel energized. Others settled his stomach after eating unfamiliar foods. A few actually made him slightly nauseous, until his body adjusted to their particular mineral content. This was Jonas's introduction to what we would now call graduated exposure therapy, though Singing Crow's people had been practicing these techniques for generations without needing scientific terminology to understand their effectiveness. The principle was elegantly simple. The human body could adapt to almost any environment, but adaptation required time, patience, and careful attention to the body's responses. Over the course of months, Singing Crow guided Jonas through increasingly complex water tastings, springs that carried higher concentrations of sulfur compounds, streams that ran through deposits of what we now know were arsenic-bearing minerals, waters so heavy with dissolved metals that they stained rocks red and orange for miles downstream. The progression was so gradual that Jonas barely noticed it happening. 1 cup became 2. A handful became a full drink. What started as waters that carried just a hint of unusual minerals progressed to springs that would have sickened most people immediately. But by the time Jonas encountered these stronger concentrations, his body had learned to process them safely. The training wasn't just about water. Singing Crow taught Jonas to read the landscape itself, how to identify which rocks produced which types of mineral springs, how seasonal changes affected water chemistry, how to tell the difference between water that would heal and water that would harm. Most importantly, she taught him the discipline required for this kind of adaptation: patience, careful observation, and absolute respect for the limits of what his body could handle. Think about what this means in practical terms. We're talking about a systematic method for building tolerance to environmental toxins that would kill unprepared humans. In modern terms, Jonas was learning to process arsenic levels that would send someone to the emergency room, sulfur concentrations that would cause severe gastrointestinal distress, and heavy metal loads that would trigger immediate poisoning responses in anyone who hadn't undergone this careful conditioning. But the training came with a price that went far beyond physical adaptation. As Jonas spent years learning Shoshone methods and perspectives, he was also becoming something that didn't quite fit in either the white world or the indigenous world. He carried 2 names, now Jonas Blackwater to the trappers and traders he occasionally encountered, and Stone Drinker to the Shoshone people who had taught him to survive in places other men couldn't even visit. This dual identity deepened when Jonas married Morning Star, daughter of a prominent Nez Perce chief named Running Wolf. The marriage wasn't just a romantic alliance, It was a political and economic partnership that cemented Jonas's position as a bridge between two worlds. Morning Star brought her own knowledge of mountain survival, plus connections to trade networks that stretched from the Pacific coast to the Great Plains. Together, Jonas and Morning Star refined the water tolerance techniques that Singing Crow had taught. They began documenting which springs could heal specific ailments, which ones were safe for building tolerance, and which ones remained deadly even to conditioned systems. They created what amounted to a mental map of medicinal waters across 10,000 square miles of Rocky Mountain wilderness, knowledge that would prove incredibly valuable as more white settlers and trappers entered the region. But knowledge this powerful couldn't remain secret forever. By the mid-1820s, stories about the white man who could drink poison water were circulating through trading posts from Fort Vancouver to Bent's Fort. Some tales were wildly exaggerated. Frontier folklore had a way of turning unusual abilities into supernatural powers. Others were disturbingly accurate about Jonas's actual capabilities. The attention brought both opportunities and dangers. Tribal leaders sought Jonas's counsel on dealing with increasing numbers of white explorers and settlers. Military officers wanted to hire him as a scout and guide. Fur company representatives offered him exclusive contracts for territory development, but the attention also attracted men like Marcus Steele, trappers who saw Jonas's abilities as either a threat to their own success or a secret that could be forced from him through intimidation or violence. The tension came to a head at the Grand Rendezvous of 1845, the annual gathering where mountain men, Indians, and trading companies conducted business for the entire Rocky Mountain region. Picture something like a combination trade fair, military summit, and frontier festival, with hundreds of participants representing dozens of different groups, all competing for the best deals and most advantageous alliances. Marcus Steele had been drinking heavily and gambling poorly when he decided to publicly challenge Jonas's reputation. Standing before a crowd of trappers, traders, and tribal representatives, Steele accused Jonas of trickery and fraud. If Jonas really could drink poison water, Steele declared, then he should be willing to prove it by sharing his methods with others. Jonas, recognizing the dangerous game being played, agreed to teach Steele the full preparation process, but only if Steele committed to following the complete year-long conditioning regimen that true mastery required. The crowd waited for Steele's response. This was his chance to call Jonas's bluff, to prove that the legendary stone drinker was nothing more than a clever fraud. Steele's refusal revealed everything about the difference between genuine mastery and mere bravado. He wanted the power that came with Jonas's abilities, but he wasn't willing to invest the time, patience, and discipline that acquiring those abilities actually required. His retreat from the challenge only enhanced Jonas's reputation and spread word of his capabilities far beyond the mountain man community. Unfortunately, enhanced reputation meant enhanced danger. Jonas's demonstration at the Grand Rendezvous attracted attention from quarters he hadn't expected, including representatives of the United States Army, who were becoming increasingly interested in any knowledge that might provide military advantages in the expanding Western territories. As Jonas and Morning Star returned to their mountain camps after the rendezvous, they carried with them the knowledge that their carefully guarded secrets were no longer truly secret. The question now was whether Jonas's unique abilities would make him a valuable ally to the various forces competing for control of the West, or whether they would make him a target for elimination. The mountains had taught Jonas to survive in places that would kill other men, but surviving the attention of governments, military forces, and competing commercial interests would require entirely different skills. By 1847, Jonas Blackwater had become something more dangerous than a skilled mountain man. He had become a legend. And legends, as any student of history will tell you, have a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention from exactly the wrong kind of people. Picture Fort Bridger in the summer of 1847, one of those rough-hewn military outposts that served as America's advancing edge into the Western territories. The fort sits in what would eventually become southwestern Wyoming, positioned to control the flow of emigrants heading to California and Oregon. It's a place where two worlds collide daily, the ordered, regulated world of the United States Army and the chaotic, dangerous reality of frontier survival. Into this collision zone arrives Dr. Elias Thornfield, 34 years old, Harvard Medical School graduate, and absolutely convinced that he represents the pinnacle of modern scientific knowledge. Thornfield has been assigned to Fort Bridger as the post surgeon, but his real mission, the one that brought him west despite having a comfortable practice in Boston, is to investigate what the Army considers dangerous medical superstitions spreading among frontier populations. You have to understand the medical establishment's mindset in 1847. This was the era when doctors still believed that diseases were caused by bad air, when bloodletting was considered a cure for everything from headaches to heart problems, when the idea that tiny invisible organisms could cause illness was dismissed as fantasy. The medical profession had built its authority on the premise that healing was a science that required formal education and institutional credentials. Folk medicine, indigenous healing practices, and particularly stories about men who could survive drinking poison, these were seen as threats to medical authority that needed to be exposed and discredited. Thornfield's assignment was clear: investigate these frontier medicine stories, document their fraudulent nature, and publish findings that would reassure both military leadership and civilian authorities that American medical science remained superior to primitive folk practices. It was supposed to be a straightforward debunking mission that would advance his career while serving the national interest. But legends, even ones you don't believe in, have a way of complicating straightforward missions. Thornfield's first encounter with Jonas Blackwater occurred at the fort's trading post, where Jonas had come to resupply before heading back into the mountains. The doctor's initial impression was exactly what he had expected: another rough frontiersman spinning tall tales to impress gullible listeners. Jonas looked the part: weathered skin, homemade clothes, that 1,000-yard stare that comes from spending too much time in places where civilization has no meaning. Nothing about him suggested education or sophistication. When the conversation turned to mineral springs and their supposed healing properties, Thornfield saw his opportunity. Here was a chance to publicly demonstrate the superiority of scientific medicine over frontier superstition. He challenged Jonas to prove his claims about water immunity, expecting either refusal or some obvious trickery that would expose the fraud. Jonas's response surprised him. Instead of making excuses or deflecting the challenge, Jonas simply asked Thornfield to identify a specific water source that the doctor considered genuinely dangerous. Thornfield, confident in his scientific training, directed Jonas to a spring about 3 miles from the fort that had killed 2 cavalry horses and sickened several soldiers who had attempted to drink from it, despite standing orders to avoid the area. What happened next challenged everything Thornfield thought he knew about human physiology. Jonas didn't just drink from the deadly spring, he drank deeply, repeatedly, while Thornfield carefully documented water samples for later analysis. The doctor expected to be writing a report about a fraud's death within hours. Instead, he found himself documenting something that contradicted fundamental principles of toxicology as they were understood in 1847. The water samples, when analyzed using the best chemical testing methods available at the time, revealed arsenic concentrations of approximately 15 parts per million, roughly 30 times higher than levels that would be considered safe by modern standards. The sulfur content was so high that metal instruments corroded after brief contact with the water. Iron concentrations reached levels that would cause severe gastric distress in anyone not specifically adapted to processing them. Yet Jonas not only survived drinking this water, he thrived on it. More remarkably, he began demonstrating how different mineral waters could be used to treat specific medical conditions. When a wagon train arrived at the fort with several emigrants suffering from cholera, Jonas used carefully measured doses of mineral water from different springs to treat the sick. His success rate was dramatically higher than Thornfield's conventional treatments. Think about what this meant for a man whose entire worldview was built on the supremacy of formal medical training. Thornfield was watching someone with no medical education successfully treat patients using methods that violated every principle he had been taught. It was like watching someone perform surgery with stone tools and achieve better results than a university-trained physician. The turning point came when Thornfield began systematically documenting Jonas's methods, instead of simply trying to debunk them. His scientific training, despite its limitations, had taught him the importance of careful observation and detailed record-keeping. What he discovered was that Jonas's treatment methods followed consistent, logical patterns that could be analyzed and understood, even if they didn't fit conventional medical theories. Jonas used iron-rich springs to treat what we would now recognize as anemia. Sulfur springs were employed for skin conditions and wound cleaning. Alkaline waters helped with digestive problems. Most importantly, Jonas never used these treatments randomly. He carefully assessed each patient's condition and selected specific water sources based on their particular mineral compositions. Thornfield's journal entries from this period, which survived in military archives, document his growing realization that he was witnessing something genuinely revolutionary. Here's a direct quote from his notes dated August 15, 1847. Subject demonstrates consistent ability to consume mineral waters at concentrations that should prove fatal to unprepared humans. More significantly, subject's treatment protocols show therapeutic efficacy that exceeds conventional methods for several common frontier ailments. But the most dramatic demonstration of Jonas's abilities came in late 1847, when a wagon train of nearly 200 emigrants found themselves stranded at Poison Spring Crossing. This was a notorious death trap on the Oregon Trail, where the only available water source contained mineral concentrations so high that it had killed every animal that attempted to drink from it. The crossing got its name from the bones of oxen, horses, and mules that littered the area around the spring. The emigrants faced a terrible choice: attempt to drink the deadly water or die of thirst. Several had already tried the water and were showing signs of severe poisoning. Panic was setting in as people realized they might all die within sight of what appeared to be abundant water. When word reached Fort Bridger, Thornfield volunteered to accompany the rescue mission, partly out of humanitarian concern and partly out of scientific curiosity. He wanted to see whether Jonas's methods could actually save lives in a genuine life-or-death situation. What Jonas accomplished over the next 3 days represented the pinnacle of his knowledge and skill. Using a series of clay filters packed with specific types of soil, he began the process of gradually reducing the mineral concentrations in the deadly water. The filtration system he constructed was based on indigenous knowledge, passed down through generations. Different clays could absorb different types of minerals, creating a step-by-step purification process. But filtration alone wasn't enough. Jonas then guided the emigrants through a controlled exposure process, starting with tiny sips of the least concentrated filtered water and gradually building their tolerance to handle stronger concentrations. He worked around the clock, monitoring each person's response, adjusting dosages, identifying individuals who were reacting poorly, and modifying their treatment accordingly. The results were extraordinary. Of the 197 emigrants at Poison Spring Crossing, Jonas saved all but the 12, who were already too weak from previous illnesses to survive the treatment process. Thornfield documented everything, creating the first scientific analysis of mineral water adaptation and therapeutic treatment in North American medical literature. More importantly, Thornfield's attitude toward Jonas underwent a complete transformation. The Harvard-educated doctor who had come west to debunk frontier superstitions found himself becoming Jonas's most important ally and advocate. His detailed documentation provided scientific credibility for methods that had previously been dismissed as folk medicine. But this alliance between ancient knowledge and modern science came with unexpected consequences. Thornfield's reports to military headquarters attracted attention from medical researchers at universities back east. Scientific journals began requesting more detailed studies. Government officials started asking questions about potential military applications of Jonas's techniques. Jonas had spent decades trying to keep his abilities secret, sharing them only with trusted allies and family members. Now, thanks to Thornfield's scientific documentation, those secrets were becoming public knowledge. The question was whether this exposure would lead to wider acceptance and beneficial use of indigenous healing methods, or whether it would make Jonas a target for those who wanted to exploit his knowledge for less honorable purposes. As 1848 dawned, Jonas Blackwater found himself caught between two worlds yet again, but this time, instead of bridging the gap between white and indigenous cultures, He was navigating the dangerous territory between ancient wisdom and modern science, between personal knowledge and public scrutiny. The mountains had taught him to survive environmental dangers that would kill other men, but surviving the attention of scientists, government officials, and military strategists would require skills that no medicine woman had ever taught him. The final decade of Jonas Blackwater's life transformed him from secretive loner to reluctant teacher, from guardian of ancient secrets to founder of a movement that would reshape American understanding of natural healing. But this transformation came with a price that Jonas had never anticipated: the burden of responsibility for knowledge that could heal or kill, depending on who controlled it. By 1850, the world Jonas had known for 30 years was disappearing faster than snow in a spring thaw. The fur trade that had sustained him through his prime was collapsing under the combined pressures of changing fashion trends, over-trapping, and the massive influx of settlers heading to California goldfields. The mountain man era was ending, and men like Jonas faced a choice: adapt to the changing times, or become relics of a vanishing way of life. Jonas chose adaptation, but on his own terms. Working with Morning Star and their growing family, and guided by the scientific framework that Dr. Thornfield had helped establish, Jonas made a decision that would have seemed impossible to his younger self. He decided to share his knowledge systematically, creating the first organized training programs for mineral water tolerance and therapeutic treatment in North America. This wasn't a decision made lightly. Jonas understood better than anyone the dangers of his knowledge falling into the wrong hands. Improperly applied, the techniques he had learned could easily kill students rather than strengthen them. Moreover, he recognized that widespread knowledge of these methods would inevitably lead to commercialization and exploitation by people who cared more about profit than about proper application of indigenous wisdom. But the alternative, allowing this knowledge to die with him, seemed even worse. Jonas had witnessed too many unnecessary deaths from diseases that mineral water therapy could have treated. He had seen too many people suffer from conditions that the right springs could heal. Most importantly, he understood that the indigenous communities who had developed these techniques over centuries were facing cultural pressures that threatened to destroy their traditional knowledge systems entirely. Working with Morning Star's counsel and Thornfield's scientific documentation, Jonas established teaching camps at key mineral springs throughout the Rockies. These weren't casual training sessions, they were intensive, months-long programs that required complete commitment from students. Jonas had learned from his experience with Marcus Steele that there were no shortcuts to mastering these techniques. Half knowledge was more dangerous than no knowledge at all. The student selection process itself became an important part of Jonas's legacy. He wasn't interested in training people who saw mineral water immunity as a path to quick wealth or easy survival. Instead, he looked for individuals who demonstrated the patience, discipline, and respect for natural systems that successful practice required. His students included displaced trappers looking for new careers, Army scouts needing survival skills for frontier service, indigenous youth sent by tribal elders who recognized the value of preserving traditional knowledge, and surprisingly, a network of frontier women who proved especially gifted at the precise measurements and careful observation that safe practice demanded. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Jonas was creating the first systematic training programs for what we would now call alternative medicine, decades before the term existed. He was documenting treatment protocols, establishing safety guidelines, and developing educational methods that could preserve indigenous healing knowledge while making it accessible to people from completely different cultural backgrounds. The success of these programs attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Wealthy families from eastern cities began sending sick relatives to Jonas's training camps, hoping that mineral water treatments might succeed where conventional medicine had failed. Military officers sought training for troops who would be operating in frontier territories where conventional medical support wasn't available. Most significantly, entrepreneurs began recognizing the commercial potential of mineral springs that Jonas had identified as particularly therapeutic. But Jonas's greatest achievement during this period wasn't in training individual students. It was in creating a sustainable system for passing on knowledge that had previously existed only in the memories of a few. practitioners. Working with his daughter Sarah, who had inherited both his immunity and his teaching abilities, Jonas established detailed protocols for each type of mineral water treatment. They documented which springs were safe for beginners, which required advanced conditioning, and which remained dangerous even for experienced practitioners. This documentation process was revolutionary in ways that went far beyond medicine. Jonas was creating the first systematic integration of indigenous knowledge with European-style record-keeping and scientific analysis. He was proving that traditional healing methods could be studied, understood, and safely transmitted without losing their effectiveness or cultural significance. The end came in 1859, not from poisoned water or gradual illness, but in a manner that perfectly suited a man who had spent his life protecting others from hidden dangers. Jonas was guiding a group of Mormon settlers through difficult mountain terrain when they encountered a massive grizzly bear that had been wounded by previous travelers and was in a killing rage. The bear attacked the settlers' wagon, going after the children first. Jonas didn't hesitate. At 56 years old, carrying only a hunting knife and a walking stick, he placed himself between the bear and the children. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes, but it was long enough for the settlers to escape and for Jonas to inflict enough damage to drive the bear off. Jonas died from his injuries 2 days later, but not before making sure that the settlers knew how to find the nearest safe water source and which springs to avoid. It was a fitting end for a man who had dedicated his life to protecting people from dangers they couldn't recognize or understand. But Jonas's real legacy wasn't his heroic death. It was the knowledge system he had created and the students he had trained to carry it forward. Sarah Blackwater, who had married Dr. Thornfield's son and taken the name Sarah Blackwater Thornfield, established the first commercial hot springs resort at what would become Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Her operation wasn't just a luxury destination, it was a working medical facility where patients received carefully supervised mineral water treatments based on Jonas's protocols. The resort became a model for therapeutic hot springs development throughout the American West. Jonas's sons spread across the frontier territories, working as guides, scouts, and water specialists for military expeditions, scientific surveys, and commercial enterprises. They marked safe springs, warned travelers away from dangerous water sources, and trained local populations in basic mineral water safety. Their knowledge proved invaluable during the massive population movements of the 1860s and 70s, when hundreds of thousands of people were crossing territories where water quality could mean the difference between life and death. But perhaps the most important aspect of Jonas's legacy was how it bridged the gap between indigenous knowledge and American commercial development. By 1880, over 40 health resorts operated at sites that Jonas had originally identified as therapeutic mineral springs. These resorts generated millions of dollars in revenue annually and attracted patients from around the world seeking treatment for conditions that conventional medicine couldn't cure. Modern analysis has vindicated Jonas's understanding of mineral water therapy in ways that would have amazed even Dr. Thornfield. We now know that controlled exposure to specific mineral concentrations can indeed build tolerance and provide genuine therapeutic benefits. Selenium, lithium, boron, and other trace elements found in natural springs have proven immune system and neurological benefits when administered in proper dosages. Today's balneotherapy medical treatment using mineral baths and springs traces its American roots directly to the techniques that Jonas learned from Singing Crow and refined through decades of practice. More significantly, Jonas's integration of indigenous knowledge with scientific documentation created a model for cross-cultural knowledge transfer that remains relevant today. He proved that traditional healing methods could be studied, understood, and safely applied without losing their cultural significance or practical effectiveness. His approach respected the source communities that had developed these techniques while making their benefits available to people who desperately needed them. The mineral springs that Jonas identified continue to operate as therapeutic centers today, though most visitors have no idea that their treatments are based on knowledge developed by a mountain man who learned to drink poison water from a Shoshone medicine woman. The hot springs of Arkansas, the mineral baths of Colorado, the therapeutic springs of California, all trace their development to sites that Jonas Blackwater mapped and documented in the mid-1800s. Jonas's story reminds us that the most important knowledge often comes from the intersection of different cultures and ways of understanding the world. A dying teenager's encounter with indigenous healing wisdom created a bridge between ancient traditions and modern science that continues to benefit people today. It's a legacy that flows like the springs he mastered, sometimes hidden underground, sometimes bubbling to the surface, but always moving forward, always finding ways to sustain life in unexpected places. The mountains taught Jonas Blackwater to survive where other men died. But his greatest achievement was teaching others to carry that knowledge forward, ensuring that the wisdom of the peaks would continue to heal and protect long after the last echo of his footsteps had faded from the high country trails.